The U.S. trade representative is doubling down on threats to Canada, repeating comments today that the U.S. could withdraw from its trade deal with Canada and Mexico.
A shift rippled through Washington that felt larger than a routine policy skirmish, something that carried the weight of a turning point for the entire continent. The mood inside the capital hinted at the start of a campaign aimed in one direction, and Canada appeared to be the target that many believed would face an unavoidable squeeze. What followed in those early days suggested a coordinated drive by some of the most influential figures in American trade and foreign policy, and it set off a wave of anticipation across North America. It felt like the region stood at the edge of a moment that could reshape an economic order built over generations. The first sign came when US Trade Representative Jamieson Greer warned that the United States might walk away from the USMCA in 2026. He framed the future of the agreement as something the administration was prepared to let expire or renegotiate entirely. His tone made clear that the American side viewed the treaty not as a long-term anchor, but as a tool that could be replaced if it no longer aligned with Washington's priorities. It was not an offhand observation. It signaled a readiness to unravel a framework that had sustained continental integration for years and guided more than $1 trillion in annual trade. Then President Trump delivered a more forceful escalation, stating that the United States intended to confront Canada with far more pressure than before. He spoke of treating Ottawa with the level of directness usually reserved for a domestic partner, something that rattled Canadian officials who viewed the statement as a warning of deeper intervention in bilateral affairs. Diplomats, investors, and corporate leaders quickly understood that this was not posturing but a declaration of a far tougher stance. The tension sharpened again when the US ambassador raised concerns about Canada's political advertising laws, suggesting that those rules could create consequences extending beyond Canada's borders. Ottawa disputed that characterization, and the disagreement halted ongoing conversations at a critical moment. Washington then began weighing the possibility of breaking the USMCA into two separate agreements, a proposal that would fundamentally alter the structure of continental trade. That possibility signaled an environment where the foundational pillars of North American cooperation were no longer assumed to be fixed. What followed was not the chain of events many expected. Instead of watching Canada bend under the pressure, Washington began to see the force it applied boomerang in a direction it had not anticipated. Economic uncertainty in the United States started rising at the same time the administration intensified its posture toward Ottawa. Canadian officials shifted their tone as well. The Minister of Industry remarked that the administration's moves had sparked a deep sense of frustration, and he emphasized that Canada was fully prepared to confront the political pressure head-on while working closely with industry leaders and labour groups. His response reflected a broader sentiment forming across the Canadian political and business landscape. This raised a more consequential question. What if the strategy designed to corner Canada ended up placing the United States in a more vulnerable position than expected? That question lingered quietly in the background as financial analysts, global investors, and multinational corporations began noticing early signs of reversal. Washington's assumption had been simple: consistent pressure would force Canada to concede. Instead, the situation began evolving in a direction that few predicted. Canada responded by reassessing its position not as a vulnerable party, but as a country capable of reshaping its economic model to reduce dependence and broaden its global role. Rather than retreating, Ottawa adjusted its strategy with surprising speed, converting a defensive moment into an opportunity to reconfigure how it engaged with the world. The International Monetary Fund released an assessment in December 2025, highlighting Canada's resilience despite tariff risks. Analysts noted an economic adjustment that was happening faster than many projected earlier in the year. Foreign direct investment surged by nearly $78 billion, lifting total investment to around $1.5 trillion. Some analysts even suggested that Canada's performance exceeded what American policymakers had expected when they applied pressure across the border. A major part of this shift involved the restructuring of Canadian supply chains. Businesses developed two distinct systems, one built to serve the American market and another tied to global partners. This dual-path system reduced Canada's exposure to unilateral shifts in US policy. companies moved quickly to reconnect with markets across the European Union, India and South America, strengthening export routes that had been underutilized for years. Newfoundland and Labrador offered one of the clearest examples of this reorientation. More than half of its oil production now flowed to Europe, compared to the small fraction that traveled across the Atlantic 2 decades earlier. That change reflected not only a commercial adjustment but also an evolving geopolitical alignment as Europe searched for stable energy sources outside regions facing conflict and political unpredictability. All of this raised a deeper question about how external pressure could become the source of internal renewal. A strategy that aimed to weaken Canada appeared to be driving the country toward a stronger and more diversified position. Meanwhile, the United States began experiencing economic turbulence that hinted at unintended consequences of its own approach. Manufacturing in the United States contracted for 9 consecutive months leading into November 2025, marking the most prolonged downturn since the 2008 crisis. This was not a shallow dip, but a pattern that signaled real stress inside the industrial core. Major transport equipment manufacturers, often considered strong indicators of industrial health, started cutting staff and shifting segments of production to other countries where policy stability seemed more predictable. This trend reflected an unease among corporations that had grown wary of uncertainty in Washington. Consumer spending added another layer of concern. Cyber Monday sales, one of the year's most closely watched benchmarks of household confidence, rose by only 2.6%. The modest increase underscored the pressure households felt under shifting tariffs and rising costs. American consumers, who usually reflected strong resilience, appeared to be tightening their spending as economic signals became more mixed. Even major corporations began challenging the administration's tariff policies. Costco, for example, filed a legal claim seeking refunds for tariff-related costs, opening the door to the possibility of billions in government liability should similar claims succeed. This development showed that corporate America was no longer content to absorb the consequences of abrupt trade decisions. Investment funds also began reassessing the United States. Analysts reported that some funds were now treating the US as a higher risk policy environment, something that would have been rare only a few years earlier. Preliminary data suggested that capital was beginning to move toward markets with steadier regulatory environments, including Canada. As Washington's volatility intensified, Canada's appeal grew in a way that few in Washington foresaw. With the second highest ratio of foreign direct investment to GDP in the G20, Canada rose to the status of a safe harbor for global capital. More than 50 free trade agreements gave companies operating in Canada access to a wide network of international markets without facing the shifting tariff climate that the US had created for itself. Corporations from Europe, Japan, and South Korea increasingly selected Canada as their North American entry point. This strategy allowed them to serve a large regional market while avoiding unpredictable policy swings in Washington. Canadian infrastructure, workforce quality, and regulatory consistency made the country a more reliable environment for long-term planning. Many US companies reconsidered their own expansion plans as well. Instead of expanding inside the United States during a period of uncertainty, they viewed Canada as a more stable base of operations. This shift highlighted a growing recognition that policy turbulence at home could undermine domestic competitiveness. In response to rising global trade disruptions, Canada moved forward with an internal reconstruction of its industrial sector. The government began encouraging manufacturers to return production to domestic plants to reduce reliance on American components. Surveys revealed that a large majority of Canadian manufacturers favored incentives that supported nearshoring, local sourcing, and supply chain independence. This marked a coordinated effort to reinforce the foundation of Canada's industrial capacity. Canadian businesses increased their reliance on domestic suppliers, strengthened partnerships with local producers, and built new manufacturing capabilities. These investments reduced exposure to tariff swings and created a more stable production environment. Meanwhile, sectors tied to the future, electric vehicles, clean energy, and critical minerals, expanded rapidly as global industries looked for reliable sources and predictable conditions. Canada became a valued supplier for industries that required stable, long-term planning. Canada also leaned into global engagement as trade barriers elsewhere intensified. The country broadened its trade outreach to Europe, India, and Asia. This global expansion transformed a regional pressure point into an opening for a diversified economic strategy. Newfoundland and Labrador's energy shift became an emblem of this broader change, one that showed how Canada was increasingly serving markets far beyond its immediate neighbourhood. The European Union, dealing with geopolitical instability in other regions, viewed Canada as a dependable partner for energy and mineral supplies. Asian businesses saw Canada as a secure gateway for accessing Western markets. With its trade agreements and regulatory stability, Canada offered advantages that American enterprises struggled to match during a period of policy unpredictability. The direction of Washington's strategy now appeared far removed from what the administration initially expected. Pressure intended to force alignment accelerated Canada's independent economic rise. If the United States ultimately withdraws from the USMCA, analysts believe Canada could strengthen its position as a major alternative manufacturing and supply chain hub within North America, a possibility few in Washington had considered when this confrontation began. The more the United States leaned into policy unpredictability, the more global companies shifted toward Canada as a reliable anchor for their long-term plans. Canada expanded its presence in critical sectors including energy, essential minerals, advanced manufacturing, and high technology. With each new investment, the regional balance tilted in ways that suggested a subtle redistribution of influence. Some voices are beginning to say that Washington might be weakening its own influence by allowing uncertainty to spread across the region. The situation that policymakers hope to shape feels farther from reach, while the landscape that emerged looks nothing like the one they planned. This shift raises a question that has grown too large to ignore. Has the effort to gain leverage ended up empowering a stronger rival right on America's doorstep, changing the regional balance in ways few saw coming? Moreover, US Ambassador to Canada Pete Hoekstra has been trying to calm rising concern over whether America's new national security strategy could open the door for Washington to lean toward political factions inside Canada. He maintains that the United States has no interest in stepping into Canadian domestic debates, yet he also points to Ontario's decision to air an ad on American television that used a Ronald Reagan quote about tariffs, framing it as an example of political messaging crossing borders from the Canadian side. His comments came during a lengthy year-end conversation with the Canadian press, where he acknowledged that the wording in the National Security Plan leaves room for a broad range of interpretations. This is exactly why critics have raised red flags, saying the document could serve as a roadmap for US involvement in Canada's internal affairs. The strategy outlines that Washington intends to reward and encourage governments, political groups, and movements that align with American goals. Former Canadian diplomat Artur Wilczynski argues that this language signals possible support for figures tied to Trump's MAGA movement and points out that Hoekstra avoided offering an absolute assurance that the United States would never interfere. That gap in clarity is fueling a debate that grows louder as both countries prepare for another politically intense year. The agreement is scheduled for its first major assessment next year. Consultations are already underway, with each country preparing its position in anticipation of what could become a pivotal moment for continental trade. Momentum has also been building at the leadership level. Prime Minister Mark Carney met with President Trump and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum during a FIFA World Cup gathering in Washington, where all three held a 45-minute discussion and agreed to keep working together on the agreement, according to a statement from Audrey Shampoo, a spokeswoman for Carney. How much influence will this review carry, and what direction will the three governments take once negotiations begin? Will the political atmosphere around these strategies reshape the partnership between the United States and Canada? To stay updated on every turn in this story, make sure to subscribe and follow the channel. Thanks for tuning in, and see you in the next one.